Okay. Right, I will start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this latest IJUBOA event, which is based around the main session on emergency response planning and preparedness. Welcome to you all. We'll just start off with some housekeeping first of all. Just on to the next slide, Sophie, thank you. We will be recording the session. Please let us know if there's any objections to that before we get into the detail of the session. Please just raise your hand on the function on Teams if you can. Much appreciated. The main items just want to mention with the housekeeping. Happy for the video to be on. If you can just keep your microphones off so we don't get any noise bouncing around. If you've got any questions, please raise the little icon hand, or if you can save the question to the end, that'll also be appreciated. Thank you very much. So presenting today, we have Mark, who you will know. Mark Hayward has presented previous. He's with Noble Denton Marine Services, and he will be covering and explaining some of the items that we are currently developing from a training perspective. And myself, Ian O'Connor, I will be also going through the emergency response planning and preparation slides as well, just to give you a flavour of what IJUBOA will be looking for from an emergency response perspective. Okay. So we'll kick off. As I said, we've done the opening, the housekeeping. I don't think, Sophie, we've got any objections with recording that I can see flagging up on the screen. So we'll kick off with Mark, looking at the manager's course that we've recently delivered and the 2 new courses for the geotechnical. And do you want to jump back one, Sophie? Do you want to just mention the AGM? Can we go back? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we're back on. Yeah, we just quickly wanted to put a slide in here about our AGM. We sent out some initial emails in September about the event, more sort of just to check in, see our members' feelers about it. We had a really positive reception. So yeah, we've gone ahead with planning our AGM. So it's Thursday, the 2nd of December. Some formal invitations will be going out soon this month. So yeah, keep an eye on those. Yeah, we'll ping out sort of the details and how many invites, but it will be on the River Thames. We'll have a cruise down the river, opportunity to network with the other members, and we'll also do a bit of a presentation on what we've achieved this year and our plans for the next year. So yeah, it'll be a really exciting event and be nice to see everyone in person. And yeah, just to say, we've also got some of our executive committee members on the course. We've got Les Lugg and Basta Young as well. So they're joining us as well in the background. So yeah, any questions for any of us, we'll be here till the end. So yeah, and I'll pass over to Mark now.
Thanks, Sophie. So fully aware that today's webinar, today's presentation is around emergency preparedness, but Sophie and Nick asked me to provide a little bit of detail about the manager's course, the geotechnical course and the elevated course. So the manager's course is a long-standing IJUBOA course, and we've worked, after a year off, we've worked hard with a bit of a revamp, taking on board feedback from nearly 10 sessions, I think, in its current format. So we've done a bit of a revamp for this year. So I've been asked just to give a bit of a trailer for the courses, how we've split them up on the back of a successful course run a fortnight ago in our offices in London. So manager's course is aimed at people project managing or managing assets to try and give a high level overview of really what people should be aware of when contracting, when project managing a project with a jack-up asset. So next slide, please, Sophie. So what we try and cover in the manager's course is an overview of the basics, a high-level review of the regulations, information about moving that asset, some key ground conditions that people should have a high level of awareness of, why it's important, some details about elevating your jack-up for the operations, for whatever you're doing in that project, and a risk awareness. So we try and drop in some case studies and some what's gone wrong aspects to try and promote safe jack-up operations. That's the purpose of IJUBOA. That's why DNV support IJUBOA in this respect. So some very clear boxes that feed into managing safe operations and ultimately hoping to contribute to your project success. Next one, Sophie, please. So like I said, a few slides about a trailer to the course. We've shared up the agenda previously, which is a bit dry. So we're just capturing some of the screenshots, example aspects from the course. So jack-up basics, we try and capture the whole spectrum of jack-ups, fully aware that IJUBOA is typically targeting the smaller assets, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the larger assets too, that we can bring back to smaller asset operations. So we don't shy away from covering some aspects with the larger assets, the big drilling unit in the right-hand corner, all the way down to some smaller assets that we're more familiar with in inshore, nearshore and river work, like the Red 7 barge in the middle. Next one, please. Ian's pulled together a really excellent section around legislation and what we need to be aware of from the manager perspective. If you're managing an asset or managing a project using a jack-up asset, what we need to be aware of and when. So whilst we might not need to be aware of nearshore or offshore work for our river-based work, your next project might need to draw on that. So we capture this high level within the course and let all the attendees walk away with a much more information as backup, some pointers as to where to look. Next one, please. Geotechnical. So following the feedback from a number of attendees to the course, this used to be very heavy. It's very important for jack-ups and we captured it in detail, but the feedback was generally that was a little bit too much for those attending the high-level managers course. So we try and capture some of the basics with understanding what you're standing on and why it's important. And again, with that focus on risk, uneven seabeds, has an asset been there previously? Are there footprints? Are there pock marks? Are there scour aspects going on? Next slide. Again, similar for the elevated case, really trying to govern what's important, what checks we should be promoting to be done for that asset, for that location. Again, whether it's river work, what extent we need to go to, all the way through to our larger offshore operations. If you're supporting typically something in renewables, there's a large O&M market, operations and maintenance market, coming about for the very nearshore wind turbine work that may be of interest to some of the attendees. And so again, high level running through the checks. And next slide. And we begin to introduce some of the basics, why that loading condition is important to understand for our jack-up asset. And again, this is an area where previously on the extended course, on the 3-day course, we went into a lot more detail. So now we've stripped that out into a standalone 1-day course. For those people who need to know more of that detail, it's stripped out into a 1-dayer, similar to the geotechnical course. Next slide, please. We capture some of the basics about moving assets. We fully understand jack-up assets that you might be using could be towed, likely to be towed, could be self-propelled for some of your members, and the importance of that transit condition. So that picture in the middle, if you are happening to venture out into the seas or moving your asset around in the seas, then why the sea state and the swell is quite important. And I put some pictures across the bottom, which is one of the case study we draw on. So these are sequential days with a bad spell of weather coming in when we were involved in moving an asset around the south coast of Britain and up to the Irish Sea. So we had to take refuge from some fairly significant seas that blew up very quickly. So we draw on that as a case study. Next slide, please. I think we're coming to the end of the manager's course. All the way through the manager's course, the focus is on risks and hazards with the purpose of trying to promote awareness of the risks and hazards and giving the attendees enough information as to what to look for, what they should do to try and avoid similar risks and hazards. The last thing we want is for any of the IJUBOA members or anyone who's been on the course to suddenly have their asset flashed up in the media having had an accident or an incident. So strong focus on managing those risks, driving safe and efficient operations. So in a nutshell, that's the manager's course. It's a high level run through for key things that we collectively think are important. It's been through a number of iterations, and Sophie's sharing up some of the recent feedback from the revamped course we ran a fortnight ago. Sophie, did you want to add anything here?
No, I won't read sort of all of them out. I can send this PowerPoint round after, but yeah, we've had some really positive feedback from the course. Yeah, so I'll leave that on screen for a couple of seconds and then I'll flick over.
Thank you. I see Frank's got his hand up.
Morning, my name's Frank Feely from Knights Brown. Have you got managers courses, a schedule of dates for managers courses coming up, or are they just organised on a as and when basis?
So we actually had a chat about this last week with Mark. We're looking to hold our next one before the end of the year. So at the moment it's looking like end of November or beginning of December. So we're just firming those up. But yeah, we're going sort of next year, we're going to create a schedule of those dates and yeah, try and stick to them. But I can definitely send over some more information about the dates this year if that's of interest.
Yeah, if you would please, Sophie.
Yeah, of course I can. Were there any other questions on the manager's course? Right, I'll move on.
Good, so thank you for that. So in a nutshell, that was the manager's course. I've covered the sort of the basics, and it's really trying to address what people need to know and might not know. So at a high level, they tend to be good interactive workshops. As Sophie said, we run them when we've got enough interest. There's obviously a minimum number of attendees to make it financially viable, but also to get the most out of the course, we need that interaction with people drawing on their experiences. Typically, there's a range of experience in the room, everything from people who have never managed jackups on any projects all the way through to those much more experienced. And the dynamics works quite well. So like I said, we've split out the geotechnical aspects for those who need to know a bit more. So this is really your technical managers or people targeting more complex locations, largely focused with offshore work, but the same would apply for estuary and river type work where there could be difficulties or where you know there are going to be challenges from the off. So next slide, please, Sophie. I'm not going to talk through everything. It's largely aimed at offshore type soil conditions. So that can be everything from very near shore to much further offshore. And purposefully, we try and capture things in a lot more detail here. It's a one-day standalone. We capture the soil conditions, preloading or pre-driving your asset, why that's important. And again, the focus on hazards. So why we're doing this stuff, what we need to know about the site you're putting your asset on, driving the hazards and hazard prevention. The next slide, please. Good, a much less wordy slide this time. Like I said, drawing on those seabed conditions, why the land and the river flow might be important historically for that makeup of the seabed conditions. Bottom slide shows some seabed layers and why they are important to understand what we're standing on. Next slide, please. Capturing the different types of soil condition we might be standing on, everything from rocks, clays, sands and very soft silts, and how they can and do vary across very small distances and very small sites, and why it's really important to understand those conditions to be able to rely on a stable work platform for whatever project you're working on. Next slide, please. Like I said, the different types of soil conditions and really what impact that has on our asset's behaviour and potential difficulties getting the unit on and off location. Next slide. Understanding the soil, so what we recommend for where site investigations are required and really what we're looking for. The middle photo is somebody breaking a clay sample, so that's a borehole log. On the right hand side is a cone penetrometer, a big metal rod that they stab into the seabed and take different types of strain gauge and pressure measurements. So purposefully going into a bit more detail if you're managing a project or managing the site investigation requirements. This course is better aimed at you rather than those who just need the higher level overview of things. Next slide, please. Seabed conditions, why we ask if we're involved in a project, why we ask for seabed conditions, why it's important to understand variations in gradient, why it's important to really understand what you're standing on. So we go into a bit more detail about bathymetry plots, why they're important, how they're taken, what we're really asking you as a project manager or as somebody involved in the project to take quality information and what we're looking for in that respect. I think there's only a couple more slides left. So again, a bit more detail about that cone penetrometer test, which is one of the recommended tests, which gives us our strength profile that the geotechnical engineers will interpret. Next slide. Yeah, and really driving to preloading and pre-driving, why we do it. So we need to understand what our soil conditions are and why we're preloading to try and withstand those loads that we're going to see. So tidal loads from river work, wind type loads, and that's where your deck and area and your cargo becomes important. And for most of the IJUBOA audience, crane loads are quite important, and how those loads are translated to the seabed and why it's important the seabed or the river floor needs to be able to react to those loads or withstand those loads. Next slide, please. Some key risks, more prevalent offshore around punch through, why understanding the ground conditions are important to help mitigate against punch through. We purposefully pulled up some smaller assets here. It makes the big news, the big media news when big oil and gas assets punch through and collapse and fall over or sink. It's equally valid to smaller assets, more akin to the IJUBOA audience. Next slide, please. And I think we can whiz through these ones, just wary of time. We've done the same again for the elevated operations for those who need to understand a bit more about the loading condition, a bit more about the environmental loads on an asset. So if you're moving into operating an asset either nearshore or offshore, having only done estuary work, this is the sort of course that's tailored for you. Or indeed, if you're used to operating nearshore, offshore, and want to know a bit more about the loading conditions, why and how they're calculated and why they're important and what they feed into in that site assessment or certificate of approval. So we can just whiz through these slides. I think we go through the process, the recommendations, the recommended guidance that as an industry we should be following. We work through, will our asset fit, and ultimately is it suitable for the proposed site? Everything from the leg length, is it long enough to firstly elevate out of the water and achieve that working height that we're interested in? We look at the wind, wave, current, or indeed tidal loading on the asset. Why that's important is our asset going to be skidding around on the seabed? Is it likely to overturn? Next slide, please. And again, yeah, focusing on that. What are the effects of our environmental loading? What are the effects of gravity? And is our seafloor strong enough to withstand those loads? So again, drawing on the importance of the seafloor, but actually not going into anywhere near as much detail as the geotechnical course. Next slide, please. Ultimately, is our asset big enough, strong enough to withstand the environmental loads that we're looking at? As soon as we begin to work offshore, we're either looking at being capable of withstanding a storm event or making sure that we retreat to a safe location prior to that storm event. So targeting elevated operations, is it going to overturn? Is it going to blow over? Is it stable? And we do some key checks and go into the explanation of those key checks about components, which aspects are likely to govern our operations, and whether it's a tubular leg, a box leg, or indeed a truss leg on some of the larger units. We'll capture some of the details around how that load is transmitted, what our key areas for inspection for checks, and indeed what our strength checks are focused on. And I think that's probably it from me.
Okay, thank you, Mark. What I would like to just do now, if anyone's got any questions on those items that Mark's gone through, please feel free to ask at this moment. Okay, what I will suggest, Sophie, because I'm just conscious of time, if you can go to slide 48 according to my PDF.
48. I can't see the page numbers. What one does it?
So let's go to the emergency response planning, because that's the longer section, so we'll get that done, and then if we have time, then we will jump back to the others. Okay, so the emergency response planning, before we start on this, there's just a couple of items that I'd like to raise. The executive committee has had quite a strong view with emergency response planning and preparedness. It's part of our IJUBOA code of practice that we have items in place for this. And it's been in discussion for quite a while that unless you're actually operating under on a larger vessel under an ISM code as such, that the emergency planning requirements for, shall we say, for some of the smaller construction assets may not be suitably aligned or cover the requirements that we would expect in IJUBOA for the operation of those assets. So what we wanted to do is go through a few items that we would see as a requirement as a member, also as a requirement, obviously, to look after your individuals and subcontractors that may also be on those assets with you. So we're just going to run through, first of all, clarify what we see as an emergency. Is there a required standard that is actually out there? What sort of suitable planning would we be looking for? There's a bit of a case history that we'll also have a bit of a look at, and then a summary from there. So first of all, we'll look at what is actually an emergency. So for a definition, we're looking for a dangerous or serious situation that happens suddenly or unexpectedly and needs immediate action in order to put it correct and get it back into control. That is fine, But what we tend to find is that the actual emergency itself is the end result of various different functions that happen leading up to the event. And we find this a lot when we carry out accident investigations, that serious situations just don't generally just occur. There are various different events that lead up to that. Quite often there's some human error involved. Quite often there may be some poor communication and misunderstanding between crew members, between the asset itself and the beach. Fatigue, we all work long hours, we all get exposed to long hours when we're on projects, so lack of understanding of what's actually occurring and what's being asked for us, or understanding the dangerous situation that we might be in is also an issue, and also lack of planning. And that's not necessarily through incompetence of the individual, it may be just through not seeing ahead what may actually occur. So we tend to find that in an emergency situation, when it does occur, that there's usually a long sequence of events that usually leads to the serious situation. So part of the planning process is trying to identify those early on and making sure that we can mitigate them. Next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, so a lot of organisations will classify their incidents into different tiers. The simplest form is tier 1, tier 2 that we have here. And in simple terms, we would be looking for minor events that can be controlled on the vessel itself or on the jack-up itself, can be dealt with by the barge master. We might be looking at first aid, deck spillage, or the likes, and it would be recorded in the incident recording system, and it may be notified to onshore within the shift. The more serious events, which we class as major, are incidents where we might need onshore support, be that internal or be that external, and we may have to bring in third-party assistance as well to try and mitigate and take control of the situation. And it's the major events that we want to really focus on, but we must also be aware that a minor event, if it's not dealt with sufficiently, can turn into a major event quite quickly. Next slide, please, Sophie. So when we say major, what are we actually looking at? Well, we've got items here, obviously serious injuries or illnesses on board. If we have to leave the jack-up vessel itself, power pack failure can be quite a common thing that we see on smaller jack-ups in the construction industry, where we get a failure and loss of electrics. That may be initially a minor issue that can turn into a major issue very quickly. If you're jacked down on tide and you've got a tidal turn, then you've got a serious issue on your hand in getting that the power back on, if the backup is not sufficient or working correctly. Collision is reasonably obvious. Structural failure or construction failure of the asset itself. Heavy weather damage or storm condition, not giving yourself enough time to get into a safe haven or into a storm survival position. Flooding or sinking or punch through, which Mark addressed earlier on with the geotechnical. What are we actually sitting on? How do we deal with the punch through? Environmental spill, if it goes off deck and it goes into the sea or in river. Man overboard, very serious event. Fire and explosion, we are held on the actual jack-up barge with fires, so we need a clear rescue plan to be able to get off the jack-up. And we also have a lot of our members carry out crane lift on jack-up, so lifting incidents can be quite a common item that also occurs. Next slide, please. So as an operator, you need to think about all the possibilities for your emergency responses, and are they foreseeable situations? Our health and safety law in this country unfortunately doesn't use the word foreseeable itself, so that can be a bit difficult. Other legislation around the world, if we go to New Zealand, Australia, they do use the term a foreseeable issue. But we need to think through, Is something likely to happen? Have we experienced it before? Have we heard of where we're going? There are issues with getting legs stuck and how we get those extracted. What are those mitigation methods? Do we understand what to do? What's the communication like between onshore and offshore, and getting communication back to the office? Do we actually test it? We do come across, when we carry out our own inspections and the likes, that drills and tests, are they actually carried out to the right level? For any of you that run an ISM vessel, yes, they will be carried out to the right level, but the smaller assets, quite often we may find that drills and tests aren't done. The emergency plan is in place, but they don't get tested. And the other issue that we also need to think about is the communication method and the coordination. In the accident investigations that I've done personally over the years, one of the bigger issues is the over communication when an event happens. There are too many people giving too many commands backwards and forwards between the asset and the beach, and confusion reigns. So we need to make that quite clear as well. Next slide, please. So let's look then at, with yourself, the interaction between the jack-up barge and the landside operations. That's a key item. Interaction between the crew and other vessels. Who's responsible for those communications? Responsibilities between the contracted parties. The case that we'll look at later on, there was an issue there between the tug and the asset, that who actually had control during the tow. That's very often an item that is raised if you've got a manned tow. The competent assessment of the mitigations, how will they work? Clear communications as well to take control, and how will you actually seek rescue if at the end of the day you have to abandon the asset. Next slide, please. So is there a required standard? That's what we need to know. So on the next slide, we'll see, if we're in oil and gas, then we all are fully aware of the safety case requirements. It's been there for many years now. It's very robust, and the agency will not permit operations unless that safety case is in place, and the full emergency requirements are held within that case. For jack-up barge that operates under IMO rules, you'll have integrated management system, safety management system, and that in itself will have emergency response and planning in there, and that will also be audited by flag state, so that will be covered. We have SOLAS to comply with as well, but when we get to the smaller asset, we fall outside of those rules. We then, from a UK perspective and also from an EU legislation perspective, we have management regulations. There is a similar EU directive which is translated into national legislation in each country around in Europe, and there's requirements in there for emergency response planning. So although it's not a maritime piece of legislation, you will under UK law have to respond to that management health and safety regulations, which is where risk assessment sits, cooperation with other companies and authority sits, and the rescue and emergency planning sits in there as well. And if we're doing construction work, we also get captured by the construction design and management regulations as well. An interesting point here for anybody that may be acting as a principal contractor or client that is bringing in a jack-up operator is there is, at the planning stage, there will be a client legal responsibility under CDM to know that their contractor is competent. So is that barge being operated competently? How will you know that? That also includes the emergency response situation. Is that covered? So you may be in a situation where you're bringing an asset in that you do not understand. How will you manage that? Who will you go to try and understand that that asset is safe on your site? Next slide, please. Now, we also have our code of practice as well. There are 3 key points under the emergency preparedness. So very simple, you should establish procedures to identify and describe and respond to all your emergency onboard situations. You should have programs for drills and exercises for those emergency situations, and you should have a management system in place that will also cover the company's organisation and how you can respond to emergency preparedness. Now, those are only 3 lines, but if we go on to the next slide, if you actually use the self-assessment tool, we then have these pertinent questions that you need to be able to respond to. And it may be worth, as I say, the slides will go around after the presentation, but it may be worth, for those of you that are responsible for your own management systems and you're not working under a ISM system, to have a look at these. Are we actually able to do that? So can you actually identify all your emergency situations? And that includes pollution as well. Does your system describe that emergency situation, and is there an appropriate response to it? Now, off the back of that, have you got people that are suitably trained to do it? Now, not just that they've been on a course. If we all think about the number of first aid courses we've been on over the years, how many of you would feel comfortable if you've not done a first aid course in a year or 18 months that you would respond to something? I would probably say that for those of you that have done first aid courses, you take it on board, but until you've actually put it into action and learnt some errors while you're trying to put a bandage on somebody or trying to deal with something, it's almost a learn on the job thing. You do the course, but you're not really taking it on board until something happens. So to what level are your people suitably trained to deal with those emergency responses for fire, first aid and medical assistance? And are personnel suitably trained for loss of personnel at sea? Is that drilled? Do you carry out a drill to do that when you go onto site? You may do it in port and carry out that rescue procedure, but when you're actually in actual operational conditions, can you actually carry out that rescue? Or is it on paper, we will do X, Y, and Z? We also need to make sure pollution events is a serious issue now for spilt oils, fuels, hydraulics, etc., going into the river or into the sea. And we need to make sure that people are also understand the emergency response for the critical items for our assets, which are punched through, leg failure, power failure as well. All the above. Do we have drills and exercises to make sure we can cover these? And is it suitably recorded? And can we show evidence of that as well? And the last point is, do we provide measures ensuring that the company can respond to these events 24/7? And that can be a point that can actually be lost. Now, you may only be working only a 12-hour shift during the day, but your asset's still going to sit there at night. How's that managed? What is the process that you've got in place to try and look after that asset and respond to it if there is an event? Next slide, please, Sophie. So the industry practice would be that you would have arrangements in place, and all those arrangements would form an emergency response plan. So it should be driven by a specific risk assessment for the foreseeable event. So your emergency response plan should be drawn up, not as a standard document, but it should be just like a method statement that we would traditionally use on a construction project. It should be specific to the site. So you may have a template that you complete, but you would need to ensure that it actually fits the location where you are currently working. And we must also be able to contact the relevant authorities for first aid and emergency medical care and rescue if it's required. If we are alongside, let's say on the Thames, then we may be able to call emergency services. But it is also worth contacting those emergency services and not make an assumption. So calling the RNLI, asking for a response. And what we often find is that they're quite happy to carry out a drill with you as well, which could be very, very, very useful. So your emergency response plan should be formed, and make sure that people understand that plan. Next slide, please. And we should also make sure that we are coordinating with other vessels and support vessels, other representatives on shore, the Coast Guard authorities, and we've also got the MRCC. If we are working offshore, we need to understand how that process works. What are the communication channels for that as well? So if we move on to the suitable planning of this, what we should be looking at, first of all, is that we've got a very clear scope of what it is that we want to do. So the company-wide structure and current response availability, what is your management structure? How do you cover it for 24/7 operations? Who are the duty holders? have come across before where people have been listed as duty holders in health and safety plans and they didn't actually know they were a duty holder when it came to emergency situations. So make sure people understand what that role is all about. Are they competent to do it? Do they have an understanding of what is required for the role? Do they understand the vessel or the jack-up, how it operates and what the risks are? We should also do an assessment of your internal response capability. So what we're looking at there is not just a drill on the jack-up itself, but every so often you should do a ship to shore drill as well, just the same as you would in an ISM system. So you should actually set up a scenario and make sure that the communication channels work and the people that are onshore understand and give backup to the situation that is happening offshore. So we need to understand a clear scope of all our risks and how we're going to respond to it. Next slide, please. So understanding the risks. Now, from all health and safety people, it's something that we always say, but it is there in the legislation. We should have an emergency planning risk assessment done. You need to carry out an assessment of everything that is likely to happen on the site, and also during the tow when you're taking the asset to that site. So we need to look at project specific responses. We need to understand the risk from the geographical location. We need to understand the local rescue systems, the authority and the network that we'll be operating in. We need to understand any historical weather data that we can see. We need to get site specific surveys because there may be a punch through risk on that site. We need to understand if there's been any issues with towage, types of vessels, what's available in getting assets into that area. So what are the sea states like, strong currents, etc. Vessel support availability, what is the local availability to give support if it's required, and also safe haven distances and suitability. We need to make sure that if we are planning towage and using safe havens, that we've got suitable time to get to those safe havens and people have the authority to call to go to those safe havens as soon as possible and not leave it too late. And we also need to make sure that we can get in those safe havens. So communication to the people that are operating those ports and the authorities that will give support, including pilots as well. We need to communicate with them and make sure that your asset will be accepted into that port, because if that is your last safe haven and your only route and you are refused, then you are technically on your own. So you need to plan that. Next slide, please. So possible emergencies, incidents leading to serious injuries, fires and explosions, we said, jacking incidents such as punch through, we could get rack phase difference and lock out the legs as well, could be a serious issue. As we said, hazardous substance, bad weather in sea state, as we see in the picture here, we need to consider loss of power and communications. Even if we have standby generators, we need to make sure that they are working correctly, suitably fueled, no water in the lines, everything's operational. Don't make an assumption that the backup will start. We need to make sure and check that it does work. Critical equipment as well, that needs to be checked. It needs to be checked. We would recommend on a weekly basis on a check sheet and a daily visual check as well for anything that we class as safety critical or asset critical to your jackup. And we also need to think about lights and shapes. They are in place, working. There may be notice to mariners that need to go out as well, because we want to avoid marine accidents, incidents and collision. Next slide, please. Okay, so the emergency response plan itself. The development of it needs to talk about how you're going to evacuate the jackup, how you're going to get people off, how you will carry out any kind of escape, be that from workshops below deck, from sleeping accommodation if you have that on board, from people operating the cranes. What if you lose power with the crane and you've got a suspended load and you've got a high wind coming in? How are you going to manage that? Your safe haven we mentioned previous. Your air gap and your survival limits for storm conditions, you need to make sure that that has been assessed. your legs are long enough for wherever you're going to be stopping en route, that you can get to a survival position. It's not a good time to find out your legs are too short. It's not a good time. So ERPs as well should also give you appropriate organisation arrangements. So who's responsible for what, organisation chart, telephone numbers in there as well, how to raise the alarm, how to raise the emergency back to shore as well. And we need to also make sure that the response plan is effective and current. The only way we will know if it's effective is to carry out drills. By carrying out the drill in a safe condition, you will find the holes in the ERP. Next slide, please. So key personnel. Every company has key personnel. Now, if we start at, I would consider the most important person, they're at the bottom of this list, the barge master themselves. What authority do they have on that barge? Again, lots of accident investigations find there's a conflict between the written authority in a health and safety document saying the barge master has ultimate authority, and the commercial pressure that is placed on the barge master from client or from his own company. So we need to make sure, if you are a barge master or you're supporting that barge master, that it's clear the authority they have, because at the end of the day, they are ultimately responsible for the people on board and for the asset. And we come back again, how many barge masters do you actually have on the vessel, on your barge? If you are 24/7, then you're going to have a rotation. You should have a qualified barge master on board at all times while you're carrying out operations. So you need to consider that we're not putting people working long hours because we only have the one barge master, or you're carrying out operations without the barge master being in place. As we come up the list, if we work under a ISM system, you'll have a designated person ashore. There is a specific qualification for a DPA. So under the IJUBOA code, we just use the phrase designated person, not person ashore. It's to avoid people wanting or feeling they need to do the full DPA course. The DPA course can be quite a difficult course to actually get on with qualifications. So we use the phrase for designated person. There should be at least one within your company, and there may be an assistant designated person as well. And you need to consider how this role actually works. That designated person should be your lifeline on the beach. So while you are working your asset, be that in an estuary, on a river, out at sea, that designated person should be available to you at all times. So again, we come back to the 24/7 again. We've got to have either the second person or a communication dedicated phone channel that we know is going to be answered. Your plan should also list other persons after that designated person that can also be called. Now, the designated person is there to take control of the situation and manage the communication channels between yourself and the senior management team and the third party support that will be on shore. Now, if you have a major emergency and the Coast Guard steps in, or one of the other authorities in the EU waters, then they will take control of that situation and your designated person will hand over. But while it's actually initially occurring, everything should be fed through that designated person. So we've got a single point of contact that is managing the situation with yourselves. So it's an important role. They have to have the authority to make decisions. They could be rang at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Nobody else is around or available. They don't want to be saying, I don't know whether I can tell you to do that or not. They need the authority to be able to make the right call. And how are they actually supported? Well, we come up then to the company senior management team. What's the management response? Do you have an emergency response team that's made up of the senior management team? What type of events will they get involved with and assess? Are their roles clearly defined and tested as well? And would they be available also out of hours? A lot of companies now are setting up as I said, emergency response teams as part of their accident incident management process, where the designated person would initially take control, as we said, and then they would feed that information into a response team headed by senior management, that once they've actually gathered and got together, they then take the role of control and command from that point. So it's understand who the key personnel are in the business, their phone numbers are available, and they are contactable, or at least you've got a designated person in place with the authority that can respond to the situation. Next slide, please. Another tool that can often be used is what we call an escalating response management approach. So we had tier 1 and we had tier 2. We have 3 other levels as well, where what we call operational control, tactical control, and strategic control. From an operational control perspective, we're looking at onboard management control of the response. So this is the barge master taking control of the situation, and on an operational minute by minute, trying to resolve and take control of the incident that has occurred. Now, that operational control will happen at all times, and we need to make sure that on the jack-up that the barge master has, again, the authority to take that control, and that there is a secondary position, because if it's the barge master that's injured or unconscious for whatever reason, or is the person that's in distress, then there needs to be a number 2 on the vessel that is just as competent and capable of managing that role. We then have tactical control. So this is where we require assistance. This is where we go through our designated person, and they set up the background onshore management and coordination, and give you the backup for the assets to respond to the emergency situation. And then we have what we call strategic control, which is where we have a major emergency, and we may start getting third-party responses as well. And this is more about company asset management. This is about media management and making sure that we ensure that the communication channels are concentrating on the emergency and the incident, and we're not getting drawn into statements to the media and to other parties. So there's 3 different levels of operation in an event. Operational control is on the jack-up. The tactical control is your support in-house from the sort of command and control, and then the strategic control is that periphery to basically keep unneeded correspondence away from the situation and allow you to concentrate on what is occurring. So your emergency response plan should look at that and make sure there are clear lines of communication that cover these roles. Next slide, please. So from a document that's available from RWE, this is their summary of these 3 levels. So if you look at operational, we're looking at recovering a man overboard from the sea, putting out a fire. These are the kind of things that may be happening. In the far right, we've got here that the third party asset may be made available to give you support. If you look at the tactical side, we're looking at coordination of assets. We're looking at allocation of site assets, getting items out to you. We've got the immediate emergency care, whether you need a third-party response to that, and liaison with the emergency services, while the operational team, the barge master and his team on the barge, are dealing with the main item. And then strategic control here, we've got a site crisis plan. Now, normally a crisis plan is looking at media control, and we're escalating it up to a large asset loss. And we're then looking at trying to prioritise and carry out business continuity and secure the business in the wider media and world while the event occurs. Next slide, please. So what should we do? What are the processes that we should be implementing? Well, emergency procedures should be clear, so we know that they should be available on board. They should be posted as well, so people are aware of them, and we should ensure that they are picked up in the inductions when people come on to the jack-up. Again, an item that we do see on the smaller jackups is very often we will bring in crane operators from third parties, from agencies and the likes to operate cranes, and they may make up a significant part of the crew, or you may have another third party in to carry out the piling operation or similar, and your asset has a barge master and a deck engineer in support. Now, we need to make sure, because numbers are down there, that the third parties that are coming on board, the contractors, are also fully aware of these emergency procedures. They may have to carry out some of those emergency actions as well. So we need to make sure that they're fully up to speed with that and they understand what the emergency response plan is. As we said before, there should be a backup deputy as well on board. So we've got a secondary call or a secondary person that can also make the decision if the barge master isn't available or cannot make that decision at that time. Okay, and we should also make sure our communication channels, be that VHF, be that mobile phone, but whichever method of communication we're using, test it on site. Don't make an assumption it's going to work. Test it before we actually need it for real. Next slide. Okay, so just as a mock-up, this is the kind of thing we would want to see posted. So we've got a very simple flow chart, that's easy to follow. So we've got an incident on the Jackup Alpha. Straight away, it's a barge master instruction. Is it a major incident tier 1 or is it a tier 2? Yes or no? If we go to the yes, we've got a barge emergency procedures we need to go to. The first thing we need to ask is it a first aid response? And then do we need onshore medical support? And there straight away, we've got telephone number for the allocated A&E hospital or medical care company that we can call on for advice. Down from that, we've got call 1, so straight into the Marine Rescue Centre, for example, if we feel that we need that straight away, whether it's helicopter support that we need or medical evacuation. Call 2 will possibly, if you were within a harbour constraint or within the, say, for example, the PLA's jurisdiction, that you would then be calling them to make them aware. They can notify all the shipping to ensure that they can assist if required, or to keep out of the area if required. Contact numbers are there as well, again for the hospital, for towing agency, the towage tug, for any of the subcontractors that we're using as well. That's also there. Call 3 into the barge operators, our designated person, inform them what is required. They would then carry out the call to the principal contractor if we're working for a principal contractor for the emergency response, and then on to the client. Takes the pressure off the barge master to do that by the land side doing that for you. And call 4 could also be technically to the principal contractor if required. But what we've got on that sheet is a straightforward and clear route of what we should do in an emergency event. I'm not saying it is the only way to do it. It's a reasonable example that we've come across. All the phone numbers are on there. All the contacts are on there. The flow of how to report it is there. We don't have to flick through page after page, trying to find information and trying to get that response out. Next slide, please. So competency. We see a lot of check sheets done about the life-saving appliances, firefighting equipment, etc. What we see less of is actual drill records where drills have actually been carried out. Again, if they're working under ISM system, that is usually done or will be done because there's a flag state requirement for that to be done. But for the smaller jackups that fall outside of that, it just reaffirms people's understanding of what to do. It is better to find a fault then than it is to find the fault when there is a serious issue on board your jackup. And please record those events and build a record up of who has been suitably trained and who is competent to carry out the relevant tasks. Next slide, and then the one after. So just as a sort of a roundup, we talked about all of those things. But we'll just look at this particular accident that occurred. So this was back in 2016. It's from the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board, so it's an issued report. We're looking at the Amber 2 tug and the sea worker barge that was lost in 2016. Next slide, please. So just as a bit of a background, in the top right here of Denmark, so area of Jutland, they were leaving the port of Frederikshavn and moving around to Ejsberg. It was a reasonably simple tow, and while they were moving the vessel round, they lost the towing arrangement. Towing bridle gave way, and the jackal barge became free. And from that point onwards, it generally sort of broke down with the response plan, what was going to happen, who was supposed to do what, all started to get quite complicated. Now, it's quite easy at this point to say, oh, well, the reason behind the accident was because the towing arrangement failed. But that was the end result of many things that happened prior to the event. So next slide, please. So the tow line gave way, and it was 6 nautical miles off the west coast in the North Sea. The tug was having difficulty making speed. We had significant wave height of between 2.5 and 3 meters. There was significant wind shear as well, and they were finding the towage hard work. Now, as you can see on the two diagrams below, the ideal tow we've got in the middle picture, where we've got some slack on the line and we can take some of the expansion in the tow line. The issue they had was because of the waves that they were trying to pull through, that the tow line became taut, and basically you had a heavier asset in the jackal barge than you did in the tug, although you had a tug that had quite a high bollard pull, and basically were overstretching the tow line, and eventually the tow line failed. So it was a reasonably obvious item that could have failed in these conditions, but it then developed further into where the emergency response plan should have covered these items. It sort of developed further, and more events happened. The first item that went wrong was that there was an emergency towing equipment on board, so that makes sense. And what they hadn't done is tested that how the emergency towing equipment actually works. Now, for the emergency tow line to work, it should have been deployed at port, and it should be pulled along in the water so that the tug can actually go and pick it up. It wasn't deployed until this tow line gave way, and when they did deploy it, it just got pushed up against the side of the barge, got fouled on the barge, and it couldn't be recovered. So no longer could the tug get the emergency tow line connected. So at that point, we went from a planned emergency response, which was, we'll have an emergency tow line on board. That makes sense. That's what we should have. To an untested system that the people on the barge didn't understand how that was supposed to operate. The tug master on the tug didn't challenge what they did when they left port by not deploying it. And then when it was eventually required, it failed because it was deployed wrong. So we've gone from a reasonably serious issue of a tow line failing to suddenly having a tow line failure and no way of getting the emergency tow line connected while at sea. So that significantly raises the risk straight away. And those are the kind of things we're talking about when we're talking about planning, and we're talking about drills and understanding and competence, that we don't just assume we've got an emergency tow line, everything's good. We need to understand how that works. Is it suitable for the tow? Is it suitable for the tug? Is the tug master aware of how it's deployed, etc. Next slide, please. So when we look at the report, we see that there was unclear authority between the tug master and the barge master. Now, if this barge had been unmanned, then it would be quite clear. Under a tow con, the tug master would have responsibility for the tow, but the barge had people on board, and the barge also had ability to move under own power, and the tug was assisting. Now that causes confusion. Who is actually in control? Is it the tug master or is it the barge master? And that was the issue that was not clearly identified before the tow was carried out. So anything that the barge master was doing, the tug master did not challenge, and vice versa. And so there's a miscommunication between both parties. As we said, the towing arrangement was misunderstood, the way that it should have been deployed and how it would operate. The next issue they had was they had 2 safe havens which were planned, and these were based on previous movements but with a different jack-up barge in the fleet. It was assumed that this jack-up barge was suitable to enter the port. When they did try and get back to port, the pilots refused entry to them because of the wind and wave conditions. So that wasn't checked and assessed before they carried out the tow. There was also miscommunication between the jack-up barge and the company on shore as well. The company misunderstood how serious the event was, and they were still planning to get a secondary support vessel out to them to connect another line and get them towed back on tow. The communication wasn't clear. The terminology used between the jack-up barge and the people on shore failed and was misunderstood, and the gravity of the event that they completely lost the tow did not come across to them on shore. So they were still trying to plan to carry out the tow with the secondary vessel. By that time, they were already drifting towards the shore, and a decision had to be made to abandon the asset. Next slide, please. Why did that happen? Well, the jack-up itself was going to be converted or used as a hotel out on a wind farm project, and it required some minor repairs to be done. But for it to get onto programme within a suitable time period, they had 48 hours to get the barge prepared for tow and to get it round to the repair yards to have the work done. So it was under a lot of time pressure. So the jack-up barge turnaround for departure was quite narrow. They didn't have time to get a third-party assessment by a warranty surveyor for the towage. And there was an assumption that the ports of shelter that they'd selected, because they'd used them previous, would accept them if there was an issue. And there was a misunderstanding of the towing requirements and what sea state that this could be operated in. So there was an incorrect configuration, and hence that the line failed as well. And the significant wave height in the documentation, this vessel jack-up is planned to operate at up to 2.5 metres significant wave height. The wave height was 3 to 3.5 metres, but the decision was to carry on. So there was a misunderstanding there of what the jack-up was capable of doing. And the other issue was on the tug itself. They could not gauge the actual pull strain that they were creating on the tow line because there was no tow line gauge fitted. So quite a high bollard pull, and rather than letting the pressure off the line, they weren't aware of how much tension they were putting in the line, and the line failed. Next slide, please. So there were lots of reasons why it failed. If the planning further ahead of that took into consideration whether the safe havens were capable of taking in the jack-up barge, that the communications had been made clear in the emergency response plan, that they had assessed the towing line correctly, and they did understand ahead and had planned for the emergency of a lost tow line and what do we do with the emergency line, how is it deployed, have been assessed, then a lot of these, or the end result of the people on the jack-up having to be evacuated and removed from the jack-up, and the loss of the jack-up on the shore wouldn't have occurred. So when you look at your ERPs, please make sure that the organisation arrangements for emergency preparedness are in place. Clear command and control structure. There's backup from secondary deputies, so other people can be communicated if needs be. There's more than one type of communication. You've got a backup if one type of communication fails. Make sure your barge master has full authority to stop actions if he feels it's unsafe for the vessel. And we shouldn't let the project constraints, time constraints, or client constraints put the barge master in a position where he doesn't consider, he downrates the risk. Clear and tested communication process, as we said. Understand your company limitations to resolve the issue. Do you need further training? Do you need further in-house drills? Have clear benchmarks where the escalation process clearly defines when a third-party assistance is required. This is one of the key items in here that it overran. They tried to resolve, and didn't call in third-party assistance quick enough. And a clear understanding of the technical aspects of the operation and their limitations as well. Okay, so slight overrun. As I said, I wanted to get that presentation run through. Any questions at all from anybody? Okay, I must have covered everything, or you're all asleep. It's one or the other. Did anyone find that useful? Did that sort of raise some questions in your own heads about your own emergency response plans? For example, open floor. Or are we all confident that our emergency response plans are 100%?
No, if I may add to that, Ian, it was a very interesting presentation indeed. And what you do see is a lot of parties are involved in emergency response. That's the key aspect I take from your presentation, the cooperation between the various parties responsible. And that is very well explained by the showcase that you gave. So thanks a lot, and it is food for thought indeed. How do the various parties responsible communicate together, and how do we make that to a suitable emergency response plan?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I'll ask our fellow directors, Baz, Les, any thoughts?
You're on mute, mute, Baz.
Sorry about this. No, this is a presentation very well done, Ian. Thank you for that. Basically covered everything from awareness to action, and everything that's in between. So, very well done.
Yeah, again, I back that up as well, Ian. But in terms of what we've covered today, hopefully people will take this away and reflect on what they are seeing, whether they operate jackups themselves, own jackups, but even if they're planning jackup works or companies working for them, it's certainly food for thought, and to look inside themselves and see, are they actually covering these elements and what can happen. Also, just in terms of spot checks, going out, visiting jackups, visiting sites, what to ask for, what to maybe look into, not just scratch the surface. So it's definitely really good to go through this, and hopefully now also just being part of the IJUBOA and being part of these meetings as well, we can trade some discussion and also build on it. So yeah, very good. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you. I will hand over to Sophie, I think, just to close us out, if that's okay.
Yeah, just a thanks to everyone for attending and to Mark and Ian for putting all their slides together. Yeah, really interesting presentation. If anyone does have any questions, then yeah, please feel free to drop me an email and I can always pass it on to Ian or Mark. Yeah, so we're always open for questions. And yeah, apologies from Nick, who couldn't come today, our chairman. He is tied up elsewhere, but yeah, big thanks to everyone for coming. I think Peter, you might have a question.
Yes, one question for the housekeeping. Will the sheets be shared and how?
Yeah, we'll distribute the recording and also the presentation, so I'll send those out via email. Might just have to reduce the file size a little bit, but it will be with you all.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.